Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Chapter 4. What a pity it is, Eleanor, said Marianne, that Edward should have no taste for drawing. No taste for drawing, said Eleanor. Why should you think so? He does not draw himself, indeed, but he has a great pleasure in seeing the performances of other people, and I assure you, he is by no means defiant in nature of taste. Though he has not had opportunities of improving it, he had never been in the way of learning it. I think he would have drawn very well. He distrusts his own judgment in such matters so much that he is always unwilling to give an opinion on any picture. But he has an innate property and simplicity of taste, which in general directs him perfectly right. Marianne was afraid of offending, and so no more was said on the subject. But the kind of approbation that Eleanor describes as excitement in him is by the drawings of other people very far fast from the rapturous delight which in her opinion could alone be called taste. Yet though smiling with herself is a mistake, she honored her sister for the blind partiality of which Edward was produced with. I hope, Marianne, continued Eleanor, you do not consider him as a deficient in general taste. Indeed, I think it may say that you cannot, for your behavior to him is imperfectly cordial, and if that were your opinion, I am sure you could never be civil to him. Marianne hardly knew what to say. She should say not the wounds of the feelings of her sister on any account, and yet to say that she did not believe he was impossible, at length she replied, Do not be offended, Eleanor, if my praise in him is nothing equal to your senses of his merits. I have not to have so many opportunities of estimating the minuter impossibilities, propensities of his mind, and his inclinations of the taste as you have. But I have the highest opinion of the world in his goodness of sense. I think of him everything that is worthy and amiable. I'm sure, replied Eleanor, with a smile, that is his dearest friend. You could have not been dissatisfied with such a commendation as that. I do not perceive how you could express yourself more warmly. Marianne was rejoiced to find her sister so easily pleased. Of his sense and of his goodness, continued Eleanor, no one can think, be in doubt, who has seen him often enough to change him in unreserved conversation. This excellence of his understanding and his principles can be concealed only by the shyness of which he often keeps from silent. You know enough of him to do justice with a solid worth, but in the minuter propensities, you can call them, you have from peculiar circumstances been kept more ignorant than myself. He and I have been at times thrown in good deal together, while you have been wholly engrossed at the most affectionate principle by mother. I have seen a great deal of him, have studied his sentiments, and I hear his opinions on subjects of literature and taste, and upon the whole time the venture I pronounce that his mind is well informed and his enjoyment of books exceedingly great, his imagination lively, and his observation just as correct as his taste, dedicated and pure. His abilities in every respect improve as much as upon request, acquittance of the manner and his person. At first sight, his address is certainly not striking, and in his person he can hardly be called handsome, until that expression of his eyes, which are uncommonly good in the general sweetness of the countenance of his uncommonly good, perceived. At present I know him so well that I think I find him really handsome, or at least almost so. What do you say, Marianne? I shall very soon think him handsome, Eleanor, if I do not now. When you tell me you love him as a brother, I shall no more see imperfection in his face than I do now in his heart. Eleanor started on this declaration. It was so for the warmth that she had been betrayed into speaking of him. She felt that Edward stood very high in her opinion. She believed the regard to be mutual, but she required greater certainty of it to make Marianne's conviction of their attachment agreeable to her. But she knew that Marianne and her mother conjectured at the moment. They believed the next with which they had to wish was hope, and hope was to expect. She tried to explain the real estate of the case to her sister. I do not attempt to deny, she said, that I think highly of him, then only great esteem that I like him. Marianne here burst forth with indignation. Esteem him? Like him? Cold-hearted, Eleanor. Oh, worse than cold-hearted, ashamed of being otherwise. Use those words again, and I will leave the room at this moment. Eleanor could not help laughing. Excuse me, she said, and be assured that I mean no offense to you by speaking in so quiet a way of my own feelings. Believe them to be stronger than I have declared. Believe them. In short, To be such of his merit, and the suspicion, the hope of his affection for me, may warrant without any imprudence of folly. But further than you must not believe. I am by no means assured of his regular regard for me. There are moments when the existence of it seems doubtful. Until his sentiments are fully known, you cannot wonder of my wishing to avoid any encouragement of my own partiality by believing or calling of it more than it is. In my heart, I feel little, scarcely any doubt of his preference. But there are other points to be considered besides the inclination. He is very far from being independent. What his mother really is, I cannot know, but from Fanny's occasional mention of her conduct and her opinions, we have never been disposed to think of her amiably. And I am very much mistaken if Edward is not like himself aware that there would be many difficulties in his way if he were to wish to marry a woman who had not either great fortune or high rank. Marianne was astonished to find how much imagination her mother and her sister had outstripped the truth. And you really are not engaged to him, she said. Yet it certainly soon will happen, but 2 advantages will proceed from this delay. I shall not lose you so soon, and Edward will have a great opportunity of improving his natural taste for you in favor of pursuit, which will be so indispensably necessary for your future felicity. Oh, if he would be so far stimulated by your genius as to learn to draw himself, how delightful it would be. Elinor gave her a real opinion of her sister. She could not consider partiality for Edward in no so prosperous a state as Marianne had believed it. There was a time of want of spirits about him, which, if it did not denote indifference, spoke of something almost as unpromising. A doubt of her regard, supposing him to feel it, need not give him more than inquietude. It would not be likely to produce that dejection of mind and frequently attended him. The more reasonable cause might be found in the dependent situation, which forbade the indulgence of his affection. She knew that his mother neither behaved to him or as to make his home comfortable at present, nor give him any assurance that he might form a home himself without strictly attending to her views of his aggrandizement. With such knowledge as this, it was impossible for Elinor to feel easy on the subject. She was far from depending on that result of his preference of her which his mother and his sister considered still a certainty. Nay, the longer they were together, the more doubtful it seemed, in fact, the nature of his regard, and sometimes, for a few painful minutes, she believed it to be no more than a friendship. But whatever might really be its limits, it was enough, when perceived by his sister, to make her uneasy at the same time, which was still more common, to make her uncivil. She took the first opportunity of affronting her mother-in-law on the occasion, talking to her so expressively of her brother's great expectation, of Miss Farrar's solution that both her sons should marry well, and of her daughter attending young woman who had attempted to draw him in, and that Mrs. Dashwood should neither pretend to be unconscious nor endeavor to be the calm. She gave her an answer which marked her concept, and instantly left the room, resolving that, whatever might be the inconvenience of expense, or so suddenly removal, her beloved Elinor should not be exposed to another week of such insinuations. In this state her spirits, a ladder was developing from the post, which contained a proposal particularly well timed. It was the offer of a small house on very easy terms belonging to a relation of her own, a gentleman of consequently and property of Devonshire. The letter was from a gentleman himself, and written in the true spirit of friendly accommodation. He understood that she was in need of a dwelling, and that though the house had offered her was merely a cottage, he assured her that everything should be done to it with which she might think necessary of this situation that pleased her. Her earnest pressed, after giving particulars of the house and the garden, and to come with her daughters to Barton Park, the place of his own residence, from whence she might judge herself whether Barton Cottage, for the house were in the same parish, could by any alteration be made comfortable to her. She seemed really anxious to accommodate them, and the whole of his letter was written in such a friendly style that it could not give a giving pleasure of his cousins, more especially at a moment when she was suffering under the cold and unfeeling behavior of her nearer connections. She needed no time for deliberation or inquiry. Her resolution was formed as she read. The situation of Barton in a county so far distant from Sussex and Devonshire, which but a few hours before would have been a sufficient objection to outweigh every possible advantage belonging to the place, was now its first recommendation. To quit the neighborhood of Norland was no longer an evil. It was an object of desire. It was a blessing. It was a comparison of the misery of the continuings of her daughter-in-law's guest, and to the removal for every of that beloved place would be less painful than to inhabit or visit in while such a woman was its mistress. She instantly wrote Sir John Middleton her acknowledgments of his kindness and her acceptance of his proposal, and then hastened to show both letters to her daughters, that she might be secure for their approbation before her answers were sent. Eleanor had always thought it would be more prudent for them to settle at some distance from Norland, but then immediately amongst their present acquaintance. On that head, therefore, it was not for her to oppose her mother's intention of removing into Devonshire. The house, too, was described by Sir John, was on so simple a scale, and that the rent was so uncommonly moderate as to leave her no right to object on either point. And therefore, though it was not plan that which brought any charm of her fancy, though it was a removal of her vicinity at Norland beyond her wishes, she made no attempt to dissuade her mother from sending her the letter of acquiescence.